Hello, and welcome back to the Masonic Roundtable, a weekly program where Masons from around the world get together to talk about Masonic news and opinions in a friendly and social manner. As a reminder, the thoughts and opinions expressed here are solely the opinions of the participants and do not represent any Grand Lodge statements or positions. Make sure you keep your conversations open for the public and on the level. To interact with us, we love seeing you live every Thursday night in the YouTube or the Facebook streams, so keep those chats coming. And as always, if your chats are good, they might end up on the show. So we'll see you there. And if you can't catch us live, catch us on your favorite podcasting app shortly after we go live. So thank you very much. You know me? That's me, John Ruark, past master of the Patriot Lodge, number 1957 in Fairfax, Virginia. Next up for his introduction, Joe Martinez. What's up, Brother Joe?
Ooh, hello, Joe Martinez.
Hello.
Joe Martinez. That's me. I said my name like 3 times, so we've established that I am he.
Beetlejuice.
Still, Worshipful Master, Manassas Lodge number 182 in Manassas, Virginia. Super fun times. Damn glad to be here.
Good luck on your stay tomorrow.
Thank you.
Next up, Robert Johnson. Heyo.
You're on mute. Do you remember how to do a podcast?
No, I forget.
Buttons.
Robert Johnson, past master, Waukegan 78, current sitting secretary over at Space Novum, 1183 in Libertyville, Illinois, the premier education lodge in the state of Illinois, where tomorrow we're going to screen the 3 Initiates book made into the movie, which is what? The Kabbalion. So
nice.
Yeah.
Ooh, where'd you get that?
Yeah, the movie.
Where'd you get that? I want the Cliff Notes movie version.
It's Mitch Horowitz produced it.
Oh,
it's real short. It's like 40 minutes, but it's good. He does a good job with it. It's not like overly crazy. It's pretty
cool.
solid.
Nice.
You're like super advanced and stuff. I make people read books and they get all assy because it's like reading. Raw.
Can I get the summary on YouTube or ChatGPT?
Yeah.
That's all I need.
Yeah, there's no need to read anymore.
Oh my goodness, that's amazing. I love the future.
All right. Let's move on to a special shout out and thanks to the Patreons who support the show. You guys are awesome. If you want to support the show, patreon.com/Masonic Roundtable. See you there. Now, tarot card of the week. We're going to limit our selection. Robert is going to handily draw only one of the suits for us. Which one?
Yeah, we're going to go with pentacles or coins. So for this week, I'm using a deck called the Antique Anatomy Tarot. It's pretty rad. I don't know if you all like that kind of thing, but I'm very into antiquarian stuff. So anyway, the back of the cards look like this. I have removed all of the pentacles / coins, as this deck refers to it, and just right, boom. Okay, so we got a page. Is it page? Page of coins. Page of Pentacles.
Ooh.
Nice.
That's pretty.
All right,
Yeah.
so
It's like a baby, with the open fountainella.
Spell baby.
The little fountain, right? You guys know about the soft spot? You hit it, and then it's called the fountain because it bleeds like a fountain if you hit it.
Wow.
I'm serious. It shoots out.
All of this is that. Yeah, right there.
But you're a knucklehead. You were in the military. You have no sagittal sutures anymore. You're just you just have a big chunk of.
Listen,
whatever.
Guy, you don't just leave for a couple of weeks and you come back and just start yelling at people about that.
Start talking about their sagittal sutures.
My sagittal sutures and stuff. Shut up. What's the card mean, John?
Page of Coins, Page of Pentacles. That's a really good card because it's about usually new beginnings, new financial things, new jobs, right? You're kind of going maybe gold. Yeah, gold. You're actually going on a new material endeavor, right? So whenever you draw that card, especially upright, it tells you like, hey, you're at the beginning. You're almost like the fool of a financial journey, right? You're at the beginning, and there's the world's your oyster, but you're also a little bit foolish too because you're young, you're immature. So it also means be a little careful, right? Don't throw good money at bad.
Don't get the extra salad bar at the Sizzler. Just go for the main dish.
Don't fill up on rolls. You got to stick to the steak.
I think a lot of times I think about these things a little bit different than some folks, but I totally agree with John in this. I like your analogy there of the beginning of a new venture. I think that's spot on.
Mhm.
That's what I would choose it to be like. If it was in masonry or something, maybe I'm going to go to a new position. A lot of us are gearing up and hearing who's going to be who in the Grand Lodge this year and
officers.
appointments and all that stuff. So
Maybe
fun
Joe,
time.
maybe.
Third time's the charm, Bubby.
Hey,
Let's do
hey,
it.
hey, hey.
We do things in threes in masonry, Joe.
Like hell we do. No, we don't.
Awesome. Okay, so here we are on our 4-part series, not 3, on the classical elements. So we kind of did an intro last week, but now we're going to do a show deep diving into the specific ones, starting with the foundation, with the prima materia, the earth. So tonight we're going to talk about a lot of different aspects of why this classical element was used, how it was used through history, some of the symbolism, and other things that go with that. So it'll be a lot of fun, a lot of correspondences. So strap in and let's go do it. So as with most things, I like starting with the historical, like where did this come from? Where did it start showing up? How was it used operatively before we start going into the speculative aspect of this? So I know Joe's done some historical research, and we'll hand the talking stick over to him.
Well, I wouldn't call it operative. I saw your analogy, but I mean, everything I'm going to be talking about is absolutely religious based.
Yes.
Rooted in the beliefs of all of these people.
Mhm.
So yeah, we're not going to talk about taking dirt and making a pile like you did when you were 3 and, making mud
pies.
cakes
Yes.
and then mud pies and then eating them. Yeah, we're not doing that. So, but we are going to talk about the history, at least the historical aspects that archaeologists and studiers of ancient cultures can attribute to different cultures based on their pronouncements about the element of earth. And we started with earth, right? And John mentioned it because it's the lowest element of the 4. We're not going to talk about the 5th one. Great movie. Go watch it. It's got what's his face in it? Bruce Willis. Yeah. But yeah, let's talk about the element of earth. So the oldest religious based texts that we have obviously come from Mesopotamia, right? The cradle of existence. And earth was absolutely linked to goddesses that archaeologists have been able to glean for us. The goddess Ninersag or Ki. And to them, when they talked about earth, especially in a spiritual context, they talk about the fertile soil and plants growing, agriculture and life growing. So the ancient Mesopotamians, the ancient Sumerians, they also believe that humans were created from clay. We hear that elsewhere, right? In other religious stories. So they did talk about a direct connection between us as human beings and the earth that we came from, the dust of the ground. Sounds like something that came out of a book that many of us read, because a lot of those creation stories came from the same source. So, if we're traveling forward in time, we're next going to go to, you just put me on the bottom. It totally just messed up my whole spatial. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So let's go next to Egypt, the fun place to be. So a lot of fun stuff about earth in Egypt. So just like Robert's doing with his hands, there were 2 gods named Geb and Nut, and they were brother and sister. And
Nice.
Yeah, well, no, it gets weird. So the primordial deity, and Geb and Nut, they absolutely loved each other. So, and they loved each other a bit too much. So Geb represented the earth and Nut represented the sky. So the ancient god Ra didn't want them to be doing the hanky-panky anymore. So he separated them. So he separated Geb, the earth, from Nut, the sky. And you may have seen those hieroglyphics. I should have brought a picture up, but Nut, you'll see pictures of Nut and Geb where Nut is basically, like stretched out over Geb. And as their father or grandfather is separating them, Nut forms the sky and becomes the starry deck canopy, as it were. And Geb represents the earth, the fertile earth. So the Egyptians believed that the earth and the sky were brother and sister and who were not allowed to. There, thank you so much. Okay, so that's Geb. And they're still kind of close, right? But as time goes on, they start to get further and further apart, so much that the earth is separated from the sky. So another big part of earth symbolism to the ancient Egyptians had to obviously do with the Nile River. The Nile was the source of life for that entire culture for 5,000 plus years. So when they thought about the earth, they thought about the Nile, flooding, things growing, agriculture, a time of plenty, things like that. And I think Robert had something to add too when it came to ancient Egypt.
Oh, I was just like half joking, right? That the idea of being illuminated made it so that like the sun god Ra wouldn't necessarily just give them the inclination to know that perhaps inbreeding is not a good idea according to biology.
And well, yes, you do. Yeah, over time you'll see that that's bad. Especially when you go to certain places in like this country, for example, you see very real examples of that. But all kidding aside, what I find super interesting is that he was really mad at Geb and Nut, but all the other children that came from that and the grandchildren that came from that were all brother and sister. Osiris and Isis, brother and sister. And Nephthys, brother and sister. So maybe he was not paying attention. Maybe he was off that day when everybody picked pairs. But
the whole concept of this sort of ideology, I think that it's fun to like think about and play games with. But if it's all just differentiating factors of the one being, right, then an intercourse between the two only leads to the proliferation of even more and more other divine attributes or other gods, right? So this is really just the anthropomorphizing of all that, I guess.
Well, absolutely. And that's how the ancients did everything, right? They anthropomorphized everything that they could see, everything in nature. Had to be associated with something so that they could understand it. And that is ancient cultures, folks. So yeah, Egypt. What else do we want to say about Egypt? I mean, there was a lot of, and I know John is going to dip his toe into the symbolic aspects and things like that. So we'll stay away from that as well. So
what about like our oldest religions, right, is like animism, where we're literally worshiping the animals and the ground that they walk on, and they live on the ground, not like well, we all did, but they had to ancient man, these are the spirits that have been there forever. So not only that, but what I think is really interesting, and this is a little bit ancient aliens-y, if you want to think about it that way, this idea that the ground itself, think about it metaphysically in terms of an actual ground, like electrical engineering. But aside from that, the idea that we seem to have latched onto the idea of ground as a foundation for the development of man, right? You talked about from the dust and all of those things, and all the various cultures who make man out of mud, and the gods breathe life into the clay man, and all of those things. But what's really interesting about that is all of that seems almost archetypal to the scientific explanation of how the species began, from an Earth, a impact with a protoplanet, to the inevitable construction of the moon, which creates the tides, which begets organisms and life. So it's crazy that we've got these ancient tales, but they're true on a level.
Right. Yeah, I love what they call it, cosmogony, right? That explains the mythological creation story. And while we have a lot of common themes, and I love that stuff, right? When you look at common themes throughout cultures, throughout history, you put them all together, you step back, and you can actually start seeing how modern science is describing the how of the what they described. And I'd agree with you there too. And look at like even some of the like the Druids, right?
So why do we do that? There. I'm like I want to pose this to Joe. I mean, in all of your studies right now, past, present, future, right? How do we, as a culture, as a species, start to acknowledge the fact that, yes, we can believe in these mythologies but those mythologies are not being literal. And then the acceptance of the fact that those mythologies might actually be, talking about real life, concrete things that we look at differently. Like, when you read the Bible, right? Like usually at the end of the story, it would say, this is the gospel according to whoever. You would read the text and then came the title, and putting the title first only is a modern adaptation, or like those weird kind of nuances in how we think about how they thought about the past. It's almost like they're a completely different species, unconnected in a conscious way to the way we process information today.
But they weren't, right? So you kind of sneakily asked 5 different questions and made it one question. So
Yeah, sure. Whatever.
You're in a mood today. So let's take the first one first. So talking about man's understanding, the cosmology, right? Man's understanding of his place in the world, right? It always starts from whether you lived 8,000 years ago or you live today. It always starts with an understanding of what you think you know right now, right? Before you learn anything new, before subjects are brought into your head and you process that information, you're like, holy crap, I know more things, right? I've gained knowledge. Before any of that, it's the stuff that we innately know, right? Whether we learned from as little babies, from our parents, or from the community that we lived in, that kind of thing. None of that stuff's changed, right? We just have access to more information and more technology, right? And I think John hit it on the head before, where let's take, and without trying to get super religious into it, let's take the story of Genesis, right? Which is one of the older creation myths. And we absolutely know that. And when I say myth, I say a story of a people, right? Not trying to make anybody
using
angry.
The term correctly. Words mean things. Good.
A mythos, yes. So in that part of the world, there are lots of similar stories that ring the same as Genesis does, right? The way the things happen and the descriptions and how they happen, and what was left for us written for us to then interpret later, whether, to Robert's point, allegorically or literally, or with a sense of symbolism to it. That's besides the point. That's the way that they understood the world. And if you actually pull Genesis apart, they do a pretty damn good job of explaining how things happen and the order in which they happen, right? So I'm a big proponent of taking things like the creation stories of old cultures and comparing them to, our modern understanding of cosmology and the Big Bang. And it's like, holy crap, they actually line up. But again, to Robert's point, it really has to do with what access to information you have at that moment in time. And that was the language that they used, and that was the words that they spoke, and that's what they shared and taught to their progeny. So, but again, it doesn't make us better. It just makes us different by having access to more things. They didn't have a Hubble Space Telescope or a James Webb.
Right. Yeah, you can't explain quantum mechanics to like a fisherman.
No, you can't. But to your point, quantum mechanics and quantum entanglement, you find those concepts in lots of ancient cultures before they could even define those words, and come up with a quanta, So yeah, it's fantastic, and it's super fascinating, and I love it. And there were 3 other questions there, and I didn't answer them, but that's okay. Whatevs back. Ew.
Next ancient.
So yeah, reference. Let's get into, so if we're leaving Egypt, let's get into I guess you could call it the Hellenization of Egypt, right? You had the Macedonians come, and then you have the ancient Greeks, and they're all living around the same time. But when you start to get into Greek mythos or Greek mythology, you have actual, to Robert's point, personifications of things that stood in place for other things. And we always think, people, when they study Greek and sometimes Roman mythology, even though I hate pointing to Roman mythology because they stole everything from everybody, right? They were the perfect thieves. We always tend to think, when we're reading stories about Zeus and Athena and Hecate and stuff like that, that a lot of the people literally believed that, hey, there was a Zeus, and hey, there was an Athena. No, they were personifications. And there were just as many people then that believed, hey, this is an allegory for this, as opposed to a physical thing that I need to worship and adore. They had the same strata of people with their religious beliefs that we do today, right? So, but back to the point about the element of earth, they had a personification, and it was Gaia, right? Super awesome pay-per-view TV channel nowadays. If you're on the web,
I was about to throw that out there. Good
love
job.
it, love it. Been a member for 2 years now. But Gaia was one of the primordial deities, right? Gaia was the earth. And she was definitely on the, like I said, in the more the Titans aspect than one of the Olympian gods. She came before all the other ones. So the Greeks did believe that everything came from the dust and then eventually returned to the dust as well. And then when you get into some of their other stories in their religious context, then you start to talk about what happens underneath the ground, the underworld, caves, things like that. Lots of symbolism there in their religious aspects as well. So Greek, super fun. What else? So we can leave Western culture if you want, and let's move a bit more east, maybe.
Let's go east.
Let's go east. So in ancient China, the element of earth, we talked about it last week. The ancient Chinese cultures absolutely talked about the 4 and most times 5 elements. And that's how they understood, and John left. That's how they understood the world that they lived in, through 5 elements. And earth was absolutely one of them. And earth represented, there you go, good book. Earth associated stability, or is associated with stability and acting as the balance for all the other elements. So back to Robert's point about being a grounding element for the ancient Chinese, it absolutely was. And it was represented in their cycles. And we showed some last week. We showed a Native American medicine wheel, and we showed some other ways to interpret the 4 different elements. So yeah, absolutely. Ancient India, the same thing. But again, it looked like most of the Eastern cultures had 5 elements as opposed to the traditional 4 that we prattle on about. But they did have a personification as well. And again, this was another culture that looked at Earth as a mother figure, right? Where things come from, where things
Mother
were born.
Earth. Wow.
Earth. Yeah, right on. And then finally, if we get into more recent peoples, we're talking about the Native Americans and the ancient Mesoamericans, very similar peoples, but all of them in any of the American continents had a much deeper reverence for all things Earth that came from the Earth than any other cultures, right? Either today or in the past. They absolutely respected and revered the Earth, and those that still survive still do to this day, right? So again, that's a little smattering of what people believed way back in the day.
A quick question: when you were looking at the research for this, and you saw some of the other cultures that had the 5 elements, were most if you don't know, that's okay, we can find out. But I want to see, is there a common theme of the quintessence across some of these that have the 5? I know that the Chinese, they had like metal, right? And they had
metal, wood, they had fire, earth, wood, metal, air, right?
Right.
And so no, there were some variations. I think when you get back into Western culture, you then start to see and it starts with the Greeks, or the earliest writings we have is of the Greeks or the Proto-Greeks, right?
Right.
You start to see the void or the ether, right? Popping up with the 5th element.
Right.
But to your point, you see in a lot of the Eastern cultures, different elements, metal, wood, fire, things that they could touch and grab. And we covered that last week, I think, as well, right?
Just at a greater, a greater spectrum.
And just for anybody watching, like you hear those words like ether, I use that term quite often to just kind of refer to like to some place beyond, I don't know what it is, right? But like this is a term that was coined in early spirituality that was abandoned by like the 50s and 60s actually, because they actually thought that the ether was a sort of actual scientific like gas or something.
Well,
it was a physical thing, right?
Yeah,
right. It was another. It was another state. Absolutely. I mean, it was around in scientific communities until 1905. So people actually had to disprove ether, but they couldn't figure out how things like light traveled in a vacuum. So they had that placeholder thing, ether, and that's where they would stick it in scientific papers and stuff through the 19th and the early 20th century. Yeah.
Cool. Love it. I'm sure there's many other cultures that we could find other parallels to, but
that's all I have notes on. So
excellent.
Boom.
That's
too bad.
Yeah. So if you could just double that and give it to the next person, that'd be great. All right. So let's talk symbolism here. So one thing that I actually did a research paper for my SRICF college, and I'm going to kind of pull pieces out of this because I actually looked at like the four worlds of the Kabbalah, and how it relates to like the four classical elements, and then other correspondences as well. So there will be weak links between these things, and so my advice is to just kind of take a step back and just kind of close one eye and turn your head and see how these things kind of fit together. They're not going to be, it's not a direct correlation, right? It's going to be how's it going, Brother Ray? So it's something that isn't provable, but it when you step back and look at all the pieces together, again, commonalities, you start to see patterns emerge, and that's what I find fascinating. So when you look at starting with Earth, it's the basist of the symbolic classical elements, right? It is the grounding part, like we talked about. It's the lowest you can go before water, and then air and fire, right? So usually when you have the symbolism of this found in allegorical interpretations of the Bible, including the Book of Genesis, you're really looking at the material level. So that's why we pulled from the tarot deck, right? The Pentacles. We said last week, Pentacles is a suit that relates to the material world, material wealth, tangible things that material things that are going to happen in your life, right? And then the other suits then therefore correspond to other aspects of your nature, and that was done purposefully by Brother A.E. Waite, who designed the Rider-Waite system that we kind of use and riff off of for quite a bit. In addition, so that's just kind of setting the stage, right? If we're going to treat the classical element of Earth as the foundation, as the material world, when you look at it from a Kabbalistic system, right, then you're looking at like Malkuth. You're looking at the very bottom of that tree of life. You're talking about the actual practical manifestation of all that has come down from heaven. Okay. Therefore, it is creation. It is where we are on this practical plane. And so that means that when we talk about these other elements, it's going to go up from there. Joe, you had a question or?
Yeah, I was going to ask you because you said two things. You started off by saying that it's Earth's the lowest of the four elements, which we know, right? Because we're standing on it. And I loved your weird Mariana's Trench analogy from last week that I'm still trying to figure out.
I'll work on it.
Yeah, work on it. Everybody watched last week's show. But it can be described in both a negative sense and in a positive sense, right? Because so, you were talking about Earth being the foundation, the primordial place where all things happen. Robert's talking about, this is where life came from, right? The moon spins around, makes the tides, makes water slosh around, and boom, magic proteins. But it also gets talked about, when we're talking about the elements in a negative context, right? That's where all the bad crap happens, right down on the ground. That's where you poop, and that's where snakes crawl, and that's where bugs are, and it's got this negative overtone to it. So for me, it's interesting, like which is the right way to look at it, right? That was a question.
My way. That's the right way.
Okay,
right.
Thank you.
So moving on from there. So when I started doing research for this, I noticed other four-tiered systems that start to have similar correspondences. So, for example, we've talked about the Pardes exegesis method for interpreting texts like the Torah and the Bible, right? And that comes from an acronym that means paradise, right? That's where we get the word paradise from, Pardes, and it's the P in Pardes actually stands for the word Peshat, which is the lowest of the ways that you read biblical or religious texts. And so Peshat literally means the surface or the straight or literal meaning of the text, right? So which I like, because that was my approach to reading the Bible before I knew all these other allegorical ways of reading it, right? It was, this is the literal word of God. This is like the words on the page are the word of God, depending on your translation. And so from there, it's the foundation. Like, you should know what the literal words say before you start advancing up and reading in between the lines of whatever religious text and getting higher orders of interpretation from there. Right, Robert?
I would say yes, but also to understand the context, because so there's something that is really, I think, is hard for people to understand.
Oh, yeah.
And this is that the literal interpretation for you is not the literal interpretation for somebody who was living 2,000 years ago. And in fact,
Or
if
for the
you,
author.
right. And so let's just pretend that one day it's 10,000 years ago and John's super smart and he writes a book. And 5,000 years later, there are some, I don't know, cool sort of Gnostic folks that follow the Church of Gnostic John, and they decide to interpret your text 500 years after you did, and you go, "Wow, that's crazy." Not you particular, the
That
royal
is
you.
not what I meant at all.
And you say, well, okay, so you're dead and gone, and these people 500 years after you die determine what you've said through their process of exegesis, which is essentially applying their knowledge of the language in which you wrote at their time, which is 500 years away from when you wrote it. And then let's say 1,000 years goes by from that 500-year point. So it's 1,500 years after you've died. We've got an entirely new system of people who are performing exegesis, who are now a part of a world where there is a dogmatic sort of authoritarian view on the text of John. And so they say everything that those Gnostic John people wrote is wrong. What we wrote is right, and we continue to define that today. So in their common sense, right? And so the error here is to automatically assume that that say a Gnostic version of something, people who studied what you wrote 500 years after would actually understand it better because they live closer to the time the language is written. And
Right. It hasn't had time to diverge or dilute.
Were you talking about a hypothetical? Because that's literally what happens today on the daily.
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
Oh,
I know. I'm just throwing, shade where appropriate.
Yeah.
I'm
and so
I love it.
this is a major problem that we deal with today. I think there's some great people on TikTok. I can't remember dude's name, but he's friggin' pretty phenomenal. Blast dudes on the daily, but he's always super kind about it. But these are the kind of things that we're looking for in understanding these things. So great points, John.
Just to put a cherry on that, because I loved what you said, and I think it is very relevant, and it does speak to the topic we're talking about today. But it's so interesting how many people will come off as an informed person by sticking to something that was, like you said, if we're talking about a 2,000 or 3,000 year old text, it was written 50 years ago, and that has now become fact instead of just dogma or a set of belief structures, right? They're replacing fact, theory, dogma. They're all becoming interspersed words, and that's so bad. And just so wrong. But yeah, excellent point.
Well, people say it's in the Bible, or then I say which translation, right? Because it depends, right? But moving on.
Don't say King James.
Yes, it's the best one. We should put it on our altars. Next section is the four worlds of the Kabbalah. So after you get used to that tree of life, well, then you realize you can stack tree of lives on top of each other, and you actually have a four-tiered system of the different worlds of the Kabbalah, and that's a whole different podcast in itself. But the bottom of those four worlds is the world of Asiya. So that is the practical world, the world of earthly pleasures and impulses, right? So directly related to Malkuth, directly related to the material world. This also relates to the symbolism of the square in Albert Pike's works. So you might see symbolism, Earth represented as a square, or Earth represented as a cube. Right, so that's another way to think about it. Why? Joe just talked about these cultures found Earth to be the stable grounding force, and so what's more stable than a cube? Like, just boom, sitting there on the ground. So that's what the four worlds. Then, another thing that I find interesting too, there is a term called, let me find it here. When I was looking at the other systems, there is also a system of the souls having 5 levels, right? So there, early Jewish Kabbalists went beyond like the tripartite concept of the soul that we kind of stick to in a lot of Christian contexts. The Jewish Kabbalists had five levels, and they also start kind of at a grounding level and have different, I guess you could call them like stages of enlightenment, right? Moving up the spiritual plane. And so the basic one of those is nefesh. That's the lowest and most basic aspect of the soul. And this part of the soul is what gives us the ability to move, eat, breathe, and reproduce. Right. So this is in this category, we're really talking about the reptilian nature, our food, reproduce, fight. Those basic things that are before our prefrontal cortex gets involved.
I was going to say bulldog nature instead of
just
reptile nature.
yeah.
My three do that all the time.
Right. So
keep going. This is great.
Yeah. So again, I find that correlation there as well to be an interesting concept. And then we have, let's see, what else do we have here? I'm just comparing my notes. We've talked about Pardes. Oh, and then let's tie this Masonically, right? We really have 4 levels of our Masonic being. So we actually have the profane world and then the 3 degrees. And so before you go up, from a being brought to light perspective, right, you have to start out as a profane, right? You start out knowing about the outside world, or what you know from Masonry exoterically, before you can then be brought in and see Masonry esoterically.
From YouTube or TikTok.
Yes, yes. It's got to get on Mason Talk.
Best place to learn about Masonry.
It is. It really, really is. So
you guys are being facetious, right?
Yes.
Because it's shitty.
it's not the greatest place.
Well, let's get back. Let's just.
All right.
Let's dive on that. Let's do it.
Let's keep going.
Say the thing.
Well, so I know, Robert, you've also had some thoughts about the Masonic application of Earth as well.
We dived. Jesus, we dive so crazy into some of these topics.
There.
Yeah, we totally get lost, I think, in the weeds, but the good kind of weeds, right? Because we're all about understanding like the nuances and where all these things come from and how we can kind of connect them all. And as I'm looking through our notes, I'm like, well, wow, we really don't have anything Masonic, about the symbolism of Earth, but it is there. We mentioned Earth a few times. I think that's very important during the ritual. And I'm not breaking anything under my obligations, so don't come at me with that. But we talk about the clay grounds between Succoth and Zaradatha, or some people say the second town differently. We talk about the clay grounds, right? And this is interesting because we talk about what clay represents later on in the degrees. We also have the idea of clay we mentioned earlier, and some of those ideas of where man comes from. There's a Native American tradition of a man being made of clay, and the 4 winds are breathed into him. And this, alluding to the 4 cardinal virtues, cardinal directions, and whatnot. And so that's interesting. But also something that I find really cool is within Masonry, we have without a doubt, I've said it a bazillion times, and I think everybody pretty much agrees that there is an element of Masonry that is unquestionably a death rite. And so within this concept is the idea that we say, from it we came, and so to it we shall sooner or later return. And this idea is really interesting to me on a level of science, right? Specifically talking about thermodynamics. So when we talk about entropy, the enclosed system, the proliferation of chaos, and then the idea that it has to contain within a system, a contained system. We have this idea of the probably theosophical folks might call vital energies or whatever have you. This idea that the vital energy, the life force breathed into, we'll call it the instrument, the human being, or the blade of grass or whatever, tends to live, and then the vital energy moves on, right, and leaves behind the remains, which are then recycled and used again to form the basis of the next thing. And so within Masonry, we have this idea of the cyclical life, the cyclical life essence, that the circle of life, if you want to go Lion King with it. And then also just that it's just quite poetic, because it does tie back to the arc of seasons and regeneration that we see in a lot of the earlier mysteries, which of course Masonry pulls from liberally. We take the best of the best and leave the rest like a salad bar.
Sizzler, but no,
Yep.
you yes, Sizzler, $2.99 salad bar. But no, you that was fantastic, and you actually made me sound like John now, because I can't form a thought. But what I was going to say was, it's interesting that you touched on something, talking about seasons and when that starts to play into our understanding of the world around us. Most of those stories and most of those lessons, I guess you could call them, they come way later, right? After sun worship, after animism. We could probably do a whole show on animism. And the understanding, like John said, of, that we come from the earth and this is where we first are, and let's try to understand everything around that. Things like cycles and stuff like that, those start to crop up a little bit later, in the human timeline. And Suncard is now getting banned for that comment.
So there's another one that I forgot, another correspondence I forgot, that we went this far and we didn't even talk about like the zodiacal signs, right? So you have the 4 elements tied to three each of the zodiac sign, or of the 12 zodiac signs. So if you look at the earth signs are Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn. And what's interesting is when you look at how that is interpreted, those signs, people under those signs actually have these kind of material or grounding qualities as well. Again, these are all blanket statements, right? Everyone's unique. These are just kind of like defaults. And I think it's an interesting little passage here that the earth signed people are sensuous and responsive. They understand and respect material things, including nature. They are attuned to reality and they get things done. So they're detail oriented, down to earth, cultivated, grounded, practical people generally.
I am not an earth sign.
You
That is
made
not
a really, you made an interesting kind of, I don't know, allusion to the zodiac there, and it made me think, because you talked about your paper for the SRICF earlier. So this concept of New Jerusalem, a 1,500 mile cube by 1,500 mile, thing that is supposed to arrive on the earth, no doubt a bright shining cube, which says has 12 gates, but alternate translations might assume that it travels through 12 gates, which are the zodiac, to arrive on the planet. So, for what it's worth.
So a cube would have
enjoy.
12 gates, right? Because a cube would have 6 sides, but then there's a obverse and a converse to each side.
Yep.
The direction you flux through those sides of the cube. So you could have 12 possible ingress egress points of the cube. 12 gates. You got me thinking. I like it.
Good. Okay.
Until space-time folds on itself. The hypercube.
Hypercube.
Tesseract.
Nice. Yeah, so that's just a little taste of like some of these correspondences. I'm sure there's many, many more. But again, one thing that I appreciate is when you pull from these different symbolic sources that have been throughout history, right? They tell similar stories, again, across cultures. And that's what blows my mind, is how, you can take this same symbolism of Earth from an Eastern culture and compare it to a Western culture that possibly never met, or maybe they did, or maybe it was all ancient aliens. We don't know. But but they have similar things. That's where I threw up kind of the intelligent design kind of thought idea, right? In the purest sense that maybe that's why there is something in our nature that we have a hard time expressing these abstract concepts, and so we're going to, you know, put them in these categories depending on what's familiar with our culture, right? As they say, like there's many ways to get to the top of the mountain, many paths to get to the top of the mountain, and so that's just the way that
That
maybe
is anti-dogmatic, sir.
Sorry.
No one likes what you just said.
Which translation? That's what I want to know. So it's how that culture understands these basic characteristics of applying these classical elements. I think that's an interesting.
But again, even when you say that, and I know you don't mean it that way, but even when somebody says something like you just said, it gets ascribed a certain level of naivety, right? Like that. Oh, people understand things in the way that they understand them because they were dumber or because they were and that's the general inclination. And I know it's not you saying that because I know you don't believe that, but going all the way back to Robert's point about people 8,000 years ago, they didn't know what a quanta was, right? And they didn't know what entanglement was, but they did a pretty damn good job of explaining phenomena that we now have ascribed names to with the vocabulary and the understanding that they had. So kudos to them, you know.
Oh yeah, I mean, again, if you've seen my circumpunk presentation, you know, in a tiled session, right, that there's diagrams that the ancients have drawn on walls that really describe things that we see now at the cellular level, and they knew what the symbol of Masonic green beans were all the way back in the day.
I'll give you a symbol, Sun card.
The one of Joe. Awesome. Well, hey, this has been great. Anything else before we start to wrap things up and do the final question?
I think the only thing that you didn't touch on, which I wanted you to touch on,
please, yeah,
that would keep us, was a lot of people in the chat were talking about geometry and how this relates to geometry and stuff like that. And I made an off the cuff comment about Plato. I don't know why I have a pen in my hand like I'm doing a lecture. I'm not. But you know, look at look at the Platonic solids, and you guys were talking about the cube. So Earth was represented by the cube, you know, in the 5 original Platonic solids that Plato came up with, right? Look at that. That's an awesome cube with a triangle in it. I know that guy. He's awesome. And it's got a thing inside of it too that's even more awesome. But you know, the original 5 Platonic solids, the cube, it's not the simplest of the Platonic solids, right? It's got more sides and more corners than the tetrahedron, I would say. But yeah, Earth is absolutely represented by the cube in more than just Greek Euclidean culture. So kudos to you.
Well, now I had to go find it, right? So here we go, looking at the Platonic solids with some correspondences there. So you can see the Earth right there in the middle, 6 faces, 8 points, 12 edges, but represented as a cube. Maybe we'll bring this back for the other elements next week.
Yeah. It's a rainbow. It's so pretty.
It is. Awesome. Okay. Anything else we missed? Anything else that you have to get in to this episode before we start to wrap things up? Okay.
Nope. I showed my slide, which was representative of the foundation stone.
Nice. Very nice. Okay. So final question of the day, which is, what does the classical element of the Earth mean to you personally? Given all of this context, given the flavor that, you know, there's no wrong answers here because it's what it means to you. Starting with Joe.
Wow, shocker.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Shocker. Awesome. So, number one, I love the Earth element. I think it goes all the way back to, for me, it speaks to our story of creation, right? And, you know, I probably said it 4 times in this episode and 10 times in last week's episode, but, you know, you have an amazing creation narrative like you find in, for example, the book of Genesis, where it talks about the 4 elements right there in the 2nd chapter, where people would not normally look for the 4 elements, but they're there and they speak to you. And for me, again, like John said, Earth is that foundation, that place where we start and that place where we come from. And if you think about it, we do come from the earth. You know, the stuff that makes us up is found in the earth. We just get some little extra magic fire spirit stuff, and then that makes us awesome. So for me, it's a good foundation. And yeah, I'm done.
Nice.
Bye.
I'm still waiting for you to get your special sauce. Over to Robert. What say you? What does Earth mean to you?
Well, I don't know. I think maybe for me, it just is representative of the beginning of a sort, right? It's the first step of the journey. All of those things. I do wonder about just how arbitrarily we as a species have organized these into their order. For instance, like, is it the first, is it the second, did the primordial sea come first, the cosmic ocean, Abzu, or whatever you want to call it? But I'm not sure that that really matters. I think in this context, I really wouldn't look at the ground as like a starting point, maybe, or of anything else other than to say for a human, it's where we live. I look at it both philosophically, as a grounding point to make sure that I'm always, keeping one foot here on terra firma when I'm in my esoteric studies, recognizing it as the halfway, it's the pH on the negative to the pH on the high, right? It's that base point between two worlds. And so in a more practical way, I also respect the idea of those four elements in their kind of like, I don't know, hippy dippy, new age kind of way, in the practical sense of like taking care of the planet, renewable energies, all of those things. So it plays a large part of my life. And I think it plays a large part in a lot of people's lives, whether they want to recognize it and call it for what it is or not.
Man, you're right, Joe. It is hard to go after Robert.
Look at the
Yeah.
Flammarion engraving. That's pretty neat.
There you go. Awesome. All right. Well, let's see. Over to me. Then the final thought I had on that was when I think about the different levels of what the classical elements mean, it'll make more sense as we go deeper. But Earth is that grounding thing, and so there are times where we're going to be in different modes. Like you're not going to stay completely grounded. You're not going to stay completely into the your astral projection kind of state of mind. You're going to be going between them. So when I think of like what does that classical element Earth mean, that's the application of like when I'm at work, when I'm in the flow zone, when I'm just focused on my job, right, my vocation, then I'm focused on that. When I'm trying to plan for my financial future, that is a material thing. That is not a spiritual endeavor per se, right? So I'm at times in those elements where I'm trying to focus on planning. I'm focused on doing well at my job, trying to make sure that I, make all my customers happy, make sure that I, get paid and get paid well for it. Like that is how I'm kind of channeling into the best part of focusing on the here and now on the material plane. Try to do it for the right reasons, and as well as realize that there's a time to disassociate from that and to say there's more to life than work, for example. There's more to life than trying to get wealth. So it's a grounding nature as well. So that's how I start to use it, apply it, think about it, and try to apply it symbolically. So awesome. Well, this was great. I want to thank you all very much for watching. We'll see you next week, and keep searching for more light. Have a good night.